The latest tech.
I'm Alexa. I can answer your questions.
Interviews.
And we are evolving, and we are seeing an amazing opportunity that is happening.
Accessibility.
Accessibility is one of our core values. It's even a part of our mission statement.
This is DoubleTap TV.
Welcome to another edition of DoubleTap TV. Thank you guys so much for being here. If you want to get involved, feedback at AMI.CA is our email address. On Twitter, if you're not already following us, it's at DoubleTap Canada with the hashtag, which is AskDoubleTap. This week, we're talking all about the future of work. We've got a really cool guest lined up for you this week. I am MARC AFLALO. Stephen Scott is by my side each and every single week. Stephen, I think the future of work has a really big, it's a really big discussion point, especially given this pandemic that we've been dealing with for the past two plus years. And I think it's important to ask the question, and I'm going to ask it to you because it needs to be asked with a disability point of view, which is there a value in working from home or working remotely when you are someone who has a disability?
Hugely. Now, it's not for everybody. And, I have to put that out there, right? I can only speak from my own experience and speak for some of the people who I've spoken to. But of course, I can't speak for every person. Everybody has a different view on this. But from the most people I speak to who are disabled, they at least want the option. At the very least, people feel that they should have the option to work from home. It makes such a difference to our lives. The journey to work in itself can be a challenge. Getting to the office, dealing with it now, of course, all these COVID restrictions that are in place in offices around the country and around the world. There are all these restrictions and social distancing, and as a blind person, that can be really challenging. Simple things like knowing where the hand sanitizers are, if they get moved or get changed, or, they move from being the kind you push manually to, ones you just put your hand under. Knowing these kind of things, if you can see, you can understand all that. You can gather that information. You can, deal with that situation quickly. You know the answer to that. It's very quick. But, if you're blind, you're just essentially stumbling your way around trying to figure all this out and hoping that people will keep you up to date with what's going on. But of course, there's so much changing landscape in the workplace that it can just be quite unnerving. Now, that's been the case for many years for many people. If you're working from home, your environment is yours. And, when I started working from home way back at the beginning of 2020, I don't know, I just felt so much better about my job. I was able to focus on my job because I wasn't worrying so much about the environment around me. I wasn't worrying about that journey to work, making sure I didn't miss the train, trying to remember how many steps it is from the top of the train station entrance to the bottom where the train comes in, and making sure I'm there on time, and factoring in other transport and all these other things you've got to think about in the journey of life and getting to work. I didn't have to do all that anymore, so it meant I could focus on the job at hand and feel a bit more relaxed. And I have to say, from a mental health perspective, certainly from my point of view, I just felt a lot more relaxed. I felt a lot more chilled out. It didn't make the work any easier. Still, there was work to be done. But at the same token, it made me feel more comfortable because I was more in control of my environment.
There's so much volatility with the job market these days, and this is worldwide. They're saying there's a job shortage in certain industries, which I think may or may not be the case. I think there's also, a lot of people who are now picking and choosing the work in which they want to venture into. But I'm curious about your opinion in terms of how the pandemic has changed our chances of getting a job in the first place.
Well, it's more difficult in some ways. Where you say, most people are picking and choosing the jobs, that's true for most people, but that's not the case for most disabled people. They don't have that choice. You tend to find that a disabled employee is far more loyal to a company than someone who isn't disabled. And I can say that with a certain amount of certainty for most, if not all, disabled people. Of course, there are lazy people out there who are disabled as well, right? There's always that guy or girl in the office who, doesn't really quite pull their weight. That's the case with anybody in any place. But with disabled people, there is a tendency, because it's so difficult to get hold of a job, that you want to try and keep hold of it. So, you're less likely to just make the move and change. And if you are in a position where you've been let go from your job and you're trying to find a new one, think about that nowadays. You're up against everybody else who is trying to get that same job as you are. And in a world where disability, despite the progress we've made, and we have made a lot, we shouldn't forget that, but we're still in a world where people still see disability as a major negative. We've got to change that. We've got to change that attitude. We hope shows like this go some way to do that. We hope the interview we have today with Dave Dane will will show you the capability of people with disabilities. We have to push that message forward because we have to be seen as, if not equal, certainly as capable as anybody else who's going for that role.
You know, Dave Dame is on deck and he's standing by, and he's a director of accessibility for Windows and devices at Microsoft, which leads me to my final question here in this segment, which is, you know, how has Microsoft helped the disabled community in terms of, you know, employing them, in terms of employing disabled people?
Well, it's about employing disabled people, of course. That's massive, and that shows the very things I'm talking about, which is showing the capability of people who are disabled by showing what they do. But it's also the fact that they showcase people with disability, not in some kind of show way, as in, you know, for example, it's like, oh, look, we've employed a disabled person, let me show you this. That's not what I mean. What I mean is that they show through the work they do, through the products they create, that they invite disabled people in to have their say. They create products with disabled people, not for disabled people, and that's really important. But also they message that to the world as well. They tell the world about the value of disability, the value of disabled people, and the value of the tools that make technology more accessible, to show that someone who is going into a job can use the same tools that you're using and still do the same job without that much in the way of adaptation. Maybe there might be some, but ultimately a lot less than there used to be because of the accessibility tools they've put into their software. So it's the messaging that really Microsoft, I think, needs to be credited with here.
Well, let's dive in a little bit deeper, or a lot deeper, with Dave Dame after we take a quick break here on DoubleTap TV. He is Stephen Scott. I am Mark AFLALO. Dave Dame is on deck right here on DoubleTap TV.
For more great DoubleTap TV content, visit AMI.CA/DoubleTap. This is DoubleTap TV.
Welcome back to DoubleTap TV, talking all things the future of work. What does it look like when you're disabled? Well, we're going to find out more with our next guest. I am Mark AFLALO. Stephen Scott is by my side, and we welcome Dave Dame, the Director of Windows and Devices Accessibility at Microsoft. Dave, thank you so much for being with us this week.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be fun.
Dave, tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you get to work with Microsoft?
Well, that's a really interesting story. So just for the audience, I was born with cerebral palsy and I use a power wheelchair. And when you're born in the 70s, there wasn't really a pathway for somebody with a disability to get an education and to have a career, especially where I was born in Windsor, Ontario, right? But luckily I was born with the right parents that were stubborn. And it couldn't have been at any better of time where there was more rights coming up for people with disabilities, and technology was really starting to take shape. And technology was going to be the vehicle that would really handle for all the mismatches in the world. I always like to say it's not my cerebral palsy that holds me back, rather the mismatch in environment to accommodate my cerebral palsy that holds me back. So technology was a great level setter. So fast forward, I graduated university, worked at many technology companies as a developer, as a product manager, and then I started leading a lot of large teams, groups, and organizations. And last year when I turned 50, I was vice president at a major bank. And, you know, up until that point, I think you can imagine, you're always asking yourself, what do I want to be when I grow up, even at 50? But when I turned 50 and I lived beyond expectations, I started asking myself, how do I want to leave the world when I'm no longer here? And I got to speak at Microsoft Toronto right before the pandemic, back when you did talks in person. And that started the relationship. This role came up to lead accessibility for Windows and devices. And they were offering me the opportunity to work remote hybrid. And I thought this was my way I could give back to really help people with disabilities like me accomplish what I have, hopefully with a lot less effort. And because Microsoft was a huge enabler for me to get to where I am, I want to really make sure we drive the next generation of technology that will enable all people to be able to have whatever full life that makes them whole.
Dave, what was it like rocking up to Microsoft on that first day, you know, going into a company that really does share the same values that you have?
Well, first off, I'd like to give Microsoft credit. It was the first place I felt comfortable enough to self-identify as somebody with a disability. Prior to that, I never would. The first day was interesting because it's the first time you meet your boss and team remotely. It's a different experience, right? Because when the pandemic hit, at least at my last place of work, I had existing relationships I could leverage. So it was really interesting the first day coming in, meeting people virtually and remote. And it was like trying to drink from a fire hose, right? Like you have to do all your onboarding, compliance training, and Microsoft is this huge company. But what really struck me the first few days was their authenticity, kind of like what you said, Stephen. They have done the messaging, they've invested in technology. Panos always likes to say, the people that use our product should be representative of those that make the product. And to really be able to see the genuineness and authenticity throughout the organization, to really feel it's genuine, right? Because as an outsider, you're always like, is this true? Are they just putting this on? But being able to experience that authenticity on the first day, and even up until now, it's been 7 months, has been really, really gratifying and confirming that I made the right decision to pivot my career here.
Dave Dame is our guest this week on Double Tap TV, but we're going to take a quick break and come back with more after this.
For more great Double Tap TV content, visit AMI.CA/DoubleTap. This is Double Tap TV.
Welcome back to Double Tap TV, talking all about the future of work with our special guest this week, Dave Dame, the Director of Accessibility for Windows and Devices over at Microsoft. Dave, I want to ask you an interesting question, which is, since the pandemic, most of us have been relying on technology in some way, shape, or form, whether it's technology we had to learn just to obviously stay connected, or technology that we've used for so long to keep connected and to get our jobs done on a daily basis. And I think it's almost leveled the playing field a bit between people who are disabled and people who aren't, because we're all working remotely, we're all using the same tools. So do you think that this has added some value and shown employers the benefits of hiring disabled people in the workplace? Is that one of the good things we can take away from this pandemic?
No, I think we had a lot of highly skilled and talented people with disabilities not in the workforce, probably due to a lot of the logistics and what I like to call the disability tax, which is the effort disabled people got to put in that others get to take for granted to be able to organize their care and everything to get to work. Now that we can work from home, I think employers have access to talent pools that they maybe didn't have access to previously. Because think about the way we used to recruit, Stephen. It used to be proximity to the head office. Now that we can work remotely, we have dispersed talent pools, and particularly when it comes to people with disabilities, now those people that have challenges of getting out of the house now can use technology, work from home, be an active participant, bring their cognitive diversity into a lot of creative problem solving, because everybody now is on an equal platform using Teams and technology. So I believe the pandemic has proven to those legacy industries, because I think the tech industry, we always knew we could work remotely, right? That was no surprise. But the legacy organizations like banks, insurance, those type of businesses now got to learn they too can work remotely and be highly productive. So now I'm hoping with them understanding the value and the benefit of remote work, that is going to really open the doors to people with disabilities that they previously didn't have, where they can bring their talents to get that so much needed cognitive diversities for those legacy organizations to innovate like they previously couldn't.
You know, Dave, in my own broadcast career, I started off working in blindness broadcasting, I suppose you might say, when I joined up with a national charity in the UK, and that was what I did for the best part of 15 years. But in that time, one thing I learned was the importance of perspective. Blindness isn't the only disability out there. And I wonder, from your perspective, going in there as someone with cerebral palsy, what did you learn about other disabilities that helped you in the role that you now have?
The biggest thing I learned was a lot about the intersectionality that exists between and the different spectrums, right, or the severities of disabilities. So, disability is really a three-dimensional axis between, is it specific, is it intersectional, and what is the severity? Is it permanent? Is it temporary? So there's so much complexity there. So I think the biggest thing I learned was that, understanding that, the different complexities and vectors to disability. But then the whole assistive technology market out there, right? There's such a market out there. And what I learned in my research to really design our roadmaps and to put it together was there's almost I think there was $10 billion in IP reserved to do assistive technology in the next 10 years.
Clearly Microsoft are really pushing this positive message about disability and showcasing the capability of us disabled people and everything that it does through the software it creates, through the hardware it creates, through employing disabled people like yourself to talk about the issues that we face. That is really important. But it is really important as well for the company to understand the people who it's serving, because of course disability comes in many different forms. It can come from birth, or it can be acquired. Or
by aging, right? You're right, it is part of the DNA, and kudos to, even before I got there, we have Jenny LaFleury really trying to close the disability divide in education and the workplace, and all her advocacy out there. But I think what's really special about Microsoft too is we're not doing it just to benefit Microsoft. We're actually working with industry partners and other tech companies to share a lot of the best practices and a lot of learning, because we really believe in by rising the tides, all boats rise, right? So we're really looking at it even beyond Microsoft to really, how do we ensure we create a really inclusive and accessible ecosystem? But you're right, it is part of everything we decide and do. Can we get better? Absolutely, right? I'm not going to sit here and say we're perfect. There's still things we're trying to drive to be better. And as somebody with a disability, I don't know what perfect would look like, but I think we all know what better can look like. So what I really enjoy is iterating and always getting better, learning from our ecosystem and partners, as well as sharing a lot of our best practices and learnings we're getting. Because, if we create a wider, successful ecosystem, all users with disabilities win. And that's what we're really aspiring to do.
And what about education, Dave? I mean, that's another area, isn't it? Where, I remember growing up being at school where I had to use specialist tech that no one else was using. I was always the odd one out in the class. I'm wondering if you were in the same position. What do you think it means when I think about the products like the Surface Laptop SE, for example? This is a standard piece of kit that every child's going to have. It's going to have all that accessibility built in. So this, children at school who are disabled will use the same technology as their friends. That means a lot, doesn't it?
Well, exactly, right? Now, because technology is blended into the core of the product, they're not the add-on accessories, right, where we had to have apps on top of apps, separate programs. And during our time, Stephen, our parents didn't know what technology was available. Our teachers didn't know. So in the education space, we're really trying to work with educators to educate ourselves in what they need in the classroom, but really to help educate themselves in how assistive technology can meet the needs of their students. to close that disability gap, but to make the technology inclusive. Because I was sharing this story a while ago as an executive, right? When I used to get my device modified, right? I would go into an occupational therapist. They would modify it so it was easier for me to open up my device and use it. But the modifications they put on my device made my device stand out from my peers around the table. So I was reluctant to pull it out because I didn't want to look like an outsider to the group, right? But what I like about what Microsoft is doing, by building in the technology inclusively, using the same kind of product making care to ensure the aesthetics are aligned with the quality and the ability of performance. It's not just enough they can use the technology, but can they use the technology and feel included in the environment they're in? And that's what's really magical about not simply just building a product somebody can use. We're really driving to ensure it's going to be a product somebody would choose. Compliance isn't enough.
What a great quote. Compliance is not enough. Compliance isn't enough. Dave Dame, Director of Accessibility for Windows and Devices over at Microsoft. If you haven't had enough of Dave, don't worry. We're going to keep Dave around for another show where we talk all about his work on Surface devices, and that's coming up in a couple weeks here on Double Tap TV. Thank you guys for joining us this week. I hope you learned a little bit. On behalf of Stephen Scott, Dave Dame, and myself, I am Mark AFLALO. We'll catch you again on our next episode of Double Tap TV. Thanks.
Hosted by Mark AFLALO and Stephen Scott. Editing Jordan Steeves and Mark AFLALO. Voiceover Anna Vicino. Integrated Described Video Specialist Ron Rickford. Coordinating Producer Jennifer Johnson. Director Production CARA Nye. Director Programming Brian Perdue. VP Content Development and Programming John Melville. President and CEO David Errington. Copyright 2022 Accessible Media Inc.